Picture a city of 1 million people. Not a million soldiers, not a million fighters. 1 million human beings, mothers, merchants, scholars, children, packed inside walls that are slowly losing a war they cannot stop. It is the summer of 1232. The city is Kaifeng, capital of the Jurchen Jin Dynasty, one of the most powerful empires in East Asia. And outside those walls, the Mongol war machine is doing what it always does. It is waiting, tightening, suffocating. Inside the city, the plague has already started. People are dying faster than they can be buried. The food supply was gone months ago. What little remained was confiscated by soldiers who needed it more. Or so they told themselves. The defenders are using weapons that most of the world has never seen. Iron bombs packed with gunpowder, lobbed from catapults, detonating in the middle of Mongol formations. Fire lances that shoot jets of flame 3 meters long, torching anyone who gets too close to the walls. These weapons are extraordinary, and none of it is enough. On the northern rampart, Emperor Aizong of Jin stands and looks out over the besieging army. He is 34 years old. He is not a bad man. By the standards of medieval Chinese emperors, he was actually one of the better ones. He removed corrupt officials, reformed the tax code, and ended an unnecessary war with the Song Dynasty to focus his resources on survival. He tried. He genuinely tried. But he's looking out at those Mongol encampments right now, and he knows. He's known for a while. The best general his dynasty had, Wanyan Haida, is dead. The last real field army of Jin was annihilated 5 months ago in a snowstorm at a place called Sanfengshan. Every day, he watches the noose get tighter. Every day, fewer soldiers report for duty on the walls. This is where we're starting today. Not at the beginning of the Mongol-Jin War, which started in 1211, more than 20 years before this moment. Not with Genghis Khan, who launched this war and died before he could finish it. We're starting here, in the middle of the catastrophe, because this is where you feel what's actually at stake. But to understand how we got to this wall, on this day, with this emperor looking out at his doom, we need to go back to 1229, to a man who inherited an unfinished war, and the question of whether he had what it took to end it. His name was Ögedei Khan, and this is his story. Genghis Khan died in August 1227, and he left behind the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen. He also left behind something more embarrassing, an enemy that was still standing. The Jin Dynasty had been the target of Mongol fury since 1211. 16 years of war. Genghis had taken their capital, Zhongdu, which is now Beijing, in 1215. He had stripped them of most of northern China. He had humiliated their emperors repeatedly. And yet the Jin were still there, still functioning, still fielding armies. Their court had moved south to Kaifeng, a massive, heavily fortified city above the Huai River, and behind those walls and the natural barrier of the Yellow River, they had managed to survive. Here's why that matters. The Jin weren't some crumbling pushover. They had a sophisticated military, a vast network of fortified cities, and, crucially, they understood Mongol tactics well enough to counter them in certain conditions. The Mongols were devastating in open field battles. In narrow mountain passes, river crossings, and urban sieges, they were far more vulnerable than their reputation suggested. The Jin knew this. They had learned it the hard way over 2 decades of fighting. So when Ögedei was confirmed as Great Khan at the Kuriltai of 1229, a formal assembly of Mongol nobles on the banks of the Kurlan River, the first formal transfer of imperial power in Mongol history, he wasn't just inheriting a throne, he was inheriting a problem. A 23-year-old problem that his father, the greatest conqueror in history, had not managed to solve. Now, Ögedei is an interesting figure, and I think he's genuinely underrated in popular history. Put him next to his brother Tolui, and he looks unremarkable as a battlefield commander. Put him next to Genghis, and he looks ordinary. But that comparison misses the point entirely. Ögedei's genius wasn't on the battlefield. It was organizational and political. He could look at a fractious empire held together by loyalty to a dead man and figure out how to keep it together long enough to actually govern. He was generous to a fault, dangerously generous actually, and that generosity bought him loyalty that pure fear never could. He drank too much. He knew he drank too much. He kept drinking anyway. But when he needed to make hard strategic decisions, he made them without flinching. There's another dimension to Ögedei that I want to flag early, because it becomes important later. He was capable of mercy in a way that Genghis rarely was. Not softness, Ögedei would authorize brutal campaigns without hesitation. But he could listen to advisors who argued for restraint, and he could change his mind when presented with a compelling case. That combination, decisive in war, persuadable in its aftermath, is rarer than it sounds. And it would matter enormously before this story is over. The first hard decision was the one his father had been unable to make. How do you actually finish the Jin? Ögedei's first move after taking power was, surprisingly, diplomatic. He sent envoys to Jin, offering a chance to negotiate some kind of arrangement. The Jin court, for reasons that historians are still arguing about, responded by murdering those envoys. This is one of those moments in history where you genuinely want to grab someone by the collar and demand an explanation. Killing a Mongol ambassador wasn't a political statement. It was a suicide note. The Mongols treated the murder of their envoys as a casus belli of the highest order. It had helped start the Khwarezmian campaign a decade earlier, and it would start wars in Korea and Europe too. The Jin court knew this. They killed the envoys anyway. With negotiations off the table and a fresh blood debt added to the ledger, Ögedei authorized a new campaign in 1229. Mongol forces began pushing south into the Jin heartland, including a siege of Qingyang, a fortified city in the western approach to Henan province. And that's where something unexpected happened. A Jin officer named Wanyan Chenheshang was ordered to relieve the siege of Qingyang. He had a cavalry force of 400 men. The Mongols besieging the city numbered around 8,000. Let that ratio sink in. 400 against 8,000. Chenheshang didn't set up a clever ambush. He didn't try to slip through at night. He rode out onto open ground and charged, in full daylight, against 8,000 Mongol cavalry. The historian and poet Yuan Haowen, one of the great Jin literary figures of that era, wrote that this was the greatest military victory Jin had achieved in 20 years of war against the Mongols. And he wasn't exaggerating for rhetorical effect. It genuinely was. 400 men had broken an 8,000-man force through sheer, almost incomprehensible aggression. But Chenheshang's troops fought with such ferocity that the Mongols simply broke. The siege was lifted. The city was saved. After the battle, the Jin captured a Mongol messenger named Ögedei. Rather than kill him, the Jin general Yelü Chucai released him and sent him back to Ögedei with a message. "We've got all our soldiers and horses ready. Come on over and fight." Ögedei was furious. The Mongol commander responsible for the defeat was Dokolk, a member of the elite imperial guard. He was stripped of his command immediately. And then Ögedei did something that tells you everything about how seriously he was taking this campaign. He called Subutai back from the Russian front. Think about what that decision meant. Subutai, arguably the greatest operational military mind of the entire Mongol era, and the man who had already led armies further west than any Mongol force in history, who was in the middle of a reconnaissance in force deep into the steppes of Rus, was pulled off that assignment to come deal with Jin. You don't do that when you think you're winning comfortably. You do that when you've realized the enemy is more dangerous than you assumed. And the Jin weren't done. Over the next 2 years, they continued to fight the Mongols to a standstill at the strategic level. At the Battle of Huizhou in 1230, Wanyan Haida, the Jin's most capable general, defeated another Mongol push and forced even Subutai to retreat. At Daohuigu in 1231, another Jin defensive success. The pattern was becoming clear. The Mongols could not force the Tong Pass. That narrow corridor, where the Yellow River squeezes against the Hua Mountains, was the only viable western approach into Henan province, and Haida was holding it with extraordinary skill. So, Ögedei sat down with his brother Tolui and his generals and faced the fundamental question. If the door is locked and we cannot break it down, what do we do? The answer they arrived at was one of the most audacious strategic concepts of the medieval world. Before we get to the plan, I want to make something clear, because it gets lost when we tell this story entirely from the Mongol perspective. The Jin were not helpless. They were not passive victims waiting to be overrun. For most of the period from 1229 to 1232, they were fighting one of the most formidable military organizations in human history to something close to a strategic draw. In understanding why they could do that is essential to understanding why the end, when it finally came, was so complete and so devastating. Geography was the Jin's greatest asset. The Yellow River created a natural northern barrier of immense width and force. The Tong Pass, where the river squeezed against the mountains in a gorge barely wide enough for an army to move through in column, made a frontal assault from the west essentially suicidal for cavalry. The Jin had been fortifying the approaches to Henan for years before the Ögedei campaign even began. Wanyan Heda didn't hold the Tong Pass just because he was a skilled general. He held it because the Jin had invested enormous resources in making it holdable. Heda himself deserves direct recognition here. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most capable defensive commanders of his era. In a period when Mongol expansion was demolishing every opponent it encountered, from the Khwarezmian Empire to the kingdoms of Georgia and Armenia, Heda consistently managed to read Mongol movements, position his forces to exploit terrain, and deny them the open field conditions where their cavalry superiority became decisive. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't just holding advantageous ground. He was making active, intelligent decisions that repeatedly forced the most sophisticated army in the world to alter its plans. The Jin also had a crucial technological edge in one specific domain: anti-siege weapons. Their thunder bomb, a cast-iron vessel packed with gunpowder and ignited by a fuse, fired from a large catapult, was genuinely terrifying and effective against troops in the open. When it detonated, the iron casing fragmented, and the explosion could kill or wound men across a significant radius. Their fire lances, essentially early flamethrowers that shot jets of ignited material 3 meters forward, were lethal in close-quarters wall defense. When a Mongol sapper team tried to dig under the walls under a mobile wooden shelter, the defenders could lower a fire lance over the parapet and incinerate both the shelter and the men inside it. These weren't primitive weapons. They were purpose-built tools for exactly the kind of warfare the Jin were being forced to fight. And they worked, until the siege went on long enough that the people wielding them started dying of plague and starvation. But here is the fundamental strategic problem that no amount of tactical competence could solve. On every Jin victory was a withdrawal from a bank account that couldn't be refilled. Every Mongol soldier killed could be replaced from an empire stretching from Korea to Persia. Every Jin soldier lost was drawn from a shrinking pool of men defending a shrinking territory. Every fortress held was eventually isolated. Every successful defensive stand simply delayed the inevitable while burning resources Jin couldn't replace. There's also the political dimension, and it's important. The Jin court in Kaifeng was not a model of stable governance under pressure. Emperor Aizong was simultaneously fighting a war, managing internal court factions, absorbing massive waves of displaced population from the northern territories the Mongols already controlled, and trying to maintain some kind of functional economy in a state that was losing territory and tax revenue every year. He'd made genuine improvements, removed corrupt officials, reformed the tax system, ended the pointless wars with Song. But he was fighting against institutional inertia that decades of poor leadership had embedded deeply. The constant military emergencies also created a specific pathology in the Jin command structure: the promotion of men who were good in crises rather than men who were good in administration, the use of military commanders as political proxies, and the suspension of normal accountability because there was never time to establish it properly. These problems would become lethal in the final phase of the war, when Jin's internal cohesion collapsed almost as quickly as its military capacity, and the Jin were caught in the classic defensive trap. They couldn't afford to take offensive risks, so they became too conservative. But excessive conservatism cedes the initiative to the attacker, and once you cede the initiative against Ögedei and Subutai, you have already lost the war. You just haven't been told yet. Which brings us back to 1231, and the plan that changed everything. In 1231, Mongol forces finally captured Fengxiang, a key fortified city in Shanxi province west of the Tong Pass. It was a significant victory, and it had an immediate knock-on effect. The Jin garrison in Chang'an, the ancient Tang Dynasty capital sitting in the Wei River Valley, panicked and abandoned the city entirely. They didn't just retreat, they pulled the entire civilian population with them and fell back into Henan province. A city that had stood as one of China's great centers for over 1,000 years was suddenly empty. The Mongols walked into it without firing a shot. That success created an opportunity, but the Tong Pass itself was still blocked. Heda's army was still there, still capable of defending it. The core strategic problem hadn't changed. Here's the problem in its simplest form. Kaifeng sat in the middle of Henan province, to the east of the Tong Pass. To attack it from the west, you had to force the pass, which Heda had demonstrated was essentially impossible against a competent defender. The northern approach via the Yellow River was possible in principle, but would be heavily opposed. The eastern approach was logistically challenging over long distances. The Jin had positioned their main strength at the pass precisely because it was the obvious route in, and as long as they held it, Kaifeng had a defensible perimeter. The Mongol solution was elegant, brutal, and strategically breathtaking. 3 forces, 3 axes of attack. Ögedei himself would command the northern army, pushing down through Shanxi toward the Yellow River crossing. A second force would press from the east, and the third, under Tolui, accompanied by Subutai, would execute a maneuver that on paper sounds almost insane. They would march south out of Shanxi into the territory of the southern Song Dynasty, a completely separate state, not technically at war with the Mongols at this point. Travel somewhere in the range of 290 kilometers into Song lands, but then turn north and re-enter Jin territory in southern Henan, appearing behind and below Kaifeng, where no one expected an army to come from. Repeat, they were going to invade a neutral country, march nearly 300 kilometers through it without permission, use it as a strategic corridor, and then use that position to attack their actual enemy from an angle that was geometrically impossible to defend against while holding the Tong Pass. The Song court, under their cautious chief counselor Shimi Yuan, made the calculation that responding militarily would cost more than ignoring this. It was a pragmatic call. The Song army was not in a position to fight the Mongols on short notice, and escalating over a corridor march would invite a full-scale Mongol response. So they watched. The Tolui's army crossed the Han River using improvised means. Accounts mention inflated animal skins, the sort of field engineering detail that makes you appreciate what these armies were actually capable of, and marched into the rich, untouched farmlands of Song's northern provinces. Those farmlands mattered enormously. Tolui's army had been operating in Shanxi, a province that had been economically depleted by years of war. The men were worn down, and the horses were thin. Moving through Song territory gave them something extraordinary: access to food and pasture that the war hadn't reached yet. The horses ate, the men ate. The army that would fight the Battle of Sanfengshan was in significantly better condition than it would have been if it had come the direct route. Some accounts from this stretch of the campaign are genuinely harrowing. Before Tolui's forces reached Song territory, the supply situation had been desperate enough that there are records suggesting some soldiers had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Whether you take that literally or as a measure of extreme deprivation, it tells you something about the cost of this campaign, even for the supposed victors. War grinds everyone down, including the side that's winning. By January 1232, Tolui had turned north, crossed back into Jin-held Henan, and emerged south of Kaifeng. Exactly as planned. Exactly where Heda wasn't. Heda's position at the Tong Pass was now impossible. Stay and hold the pass, and Kaifeng gets attacked from the south with no field army to relieve it, and abandon the pass and surrender the strategic position he'd been defending for 2 years. Either choice ended badly. He chose to go after Tolui. He gathered everything he had. Sources give the number as around 200,000 men, and marched to intercept. He was walking straight into the trap. Let me set the scene at Sanfengshan, because the details here are extraordinary. It is February. Henan province in February is cold. Genuinely, bitterly cold. Wanyan Heda has been force-marching his army of 200,000 men, trying to catch Tolui, who has been moving fast and burning everything behind him to deny Heda's forces any ability to resupply. The Jin army hasn't eaten properly in days. Their supply lines are cut. They are cold, hungry, and chasing an enemy that keeps moving just fast enough to stay ahead. At Dengzhou, the Heda tried to set up an ambush. He positioned tens of thousands of cavalry in a valley behind the crests of mountains on either side of the road, a classic choke point setup. But Tolui's scouts found it. His response was not to retreat or to probe cautiously. He kept his main force and supply train on the road and sent light cavalry around the flanks to attack the ambushing force from behind. The ambush failed. Heda pulled his forces out and tried to establish a defensive position at Mount Yu, southwest of Dengzhou, where a pitched battle took place. The Jin fought hard. They had a significant numerical advantage, and they knew it. But Tolui changed tactics after the initial engagement, leaving a portion of his force pinning Heda at Mount Yu while sending the rest of his men north in dispersed contingents, moving fast toward Kaifeng and burning the supply stores they encountered along the way. Heda saw what was happening. If Tolui reached Kaifeng with Heda still stuck at Mount Yu, it was over. He disengaged and pursued. His army was now marching hard, without adequate food, in winter, after days of difficult fighting. And the Mongols were still moving faster. By the time the two forces converged near Sanfengshan, Three Peak Mountain, in Yunzhou, the modern-day city of Yuzhou in Henan, the situation for the Jin was already desperate. And then the weather turned. A snowstorm rolled in. Not a light flurry. A serious storm, the kind that drops visibility to almost nothing, makes roads into mired tracks, and turns exposed skin white within minutes. The Jin soldiers had been marching and fighting for days. They were starving, and their faces were going white from the cold. The accounts from this battle describe men who could barely march, let alone fight effectively. This is the moment where Tolui displayed a tactical intelligence that I find genuinely impressive, even at a remove of 8 centuries. With the Jin army freezing, starving, and desperate, with their backs against the mountain, and their situation obviously critical, the instinct would be to attack immediately. Hit them at their weakest. Destroy them now. Tolui didn't do that. Instead, he deliberately left an escape route open. He positioned his forces to funnel the Jin army in a specific direction, making retreat appear possible, even inviting. He waited. The Jin, cold and desperate, saw what looked like a way out and began to move toward it. At first, carefully, maintaining some discipline. Then, and with more urgency as exhaustion and hunger eroded their cohesion. And then, at the exact moment when the retreat was becoming a stumble, when the discipline that makes an army was starting to dissolve, Tolui closed the trap. The Jin army didn't fight. It broke. Soldiers who had been in formation one moment were running the next, and running soldiers are just targets. The Mongol cavalry rode through them. Wanyan Heda was killed in the chaos. The general who had held the Tongpass through multiple Mongol offensives, who had humiliated Dokolk, who had forced Subutai himself to retreat, who was probably the single most important military figure standing between Jin and destruction, was dead in a snowfield south of Yunzhou. Most of his senior commanders died alongside him. At nearly the same moment, something crucial was happening on the Yellow River to the north. With Heda's army drawn south to deal with Tolui, the Jin forces guarding the river crossing had been redeployed. The river was frozen solid. Ögedei, commanding the northern army, recognized the opportunity and crossed on the ice, joining up with Tolui. Their combined force at this point numbered approximately 50,000, a fraction of what Heda had commanded before Sanfengshan. But there was no longer anything between them and Kaifeng. The battle happened on February 9th, 1232. Within weeks, Kaifeng was encircled. I want to be direct about what Sanfengshan meant strategically, because I think it sometimes gets presented as just another battle in a long war. It was not. Sanfengshan destroyed Jin's capacity to fight in the open field permanently. The field army that Heda commanded, the force that had successfully defended the Tong Pass for years, that had beaten the Mongols multiple times, no longer existed. From this point forward, the only strategy available to Aizong was to get behind walls, survive as long as possible, and hope that something changed. Nothing did. I also want to acknowledge Wanyan Heda, because he deserves it. He fought a brilliant defensive campaign for 2 years against what was arguably the finest military organization in the world. He was outthought at the strategic level by a maneuver through Song territory that he had no realistic way to counter, and then he was outgeneraled at the tactical level by Tolui, exploiting weather conditions with exceptional skill. None of that diminishes the quality of his resistance. It just confirms how extraordinary his opponents were. The noose was now around Kaifeng, and Suffocating moved into position to tighten it. Quick pause. If this is the kind of storytelling you come here for, the actual details, the actual people, the moments that get skipped in textbooks, then hit subscribe if you haven't already. This channel survives on the people who keep showing up for it, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Now, back to Kaifeng. After Sanfengshan, with the siege of Kaifeng beginning and Suffocating in command of the operational details, Ögedei and Tolui departed. They returned north toward Mongolia. The siege was in the most capable hands available. There was no immediate need for 2 of Genghis Khan's sons to sit in a camp outside a city while it slowly starved. By the end of 1232, Tolui was dead. He was approximately 40 years old. He was, by general consensus, the finest battlefield commander of his generation, perhaps of the entire Mongol era. His wife, Sorghaghtani Beki, a Karaite princess of extraordinary political intelligence, would go on to become arguably the most powerful woman in Mongol history. His sons included Mongke, the 4th Great Khan, Kublai, who would complete the conquest of China and establish the Yelü Dynasty, and Hulagu, who would sack Baghdad and end the Abbasid Caliphate. Tolui's line would eventually take over the entire empire, which is part of why his death is so contested and why the records surrounding it are so murky. The official version, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, is theatrical to the point of being almost operatic. Ögedei fell terribly ill during the return north. The shamans examined him and determined he had been cursed by the malevolent spirits of Jin China, angered by the Mongol invasion of their land. Various offerings were made: livestock, gold, silk, and commoners. The spirits refused them all. They would only accept a member of the imperial family. Tolui, according to this account, stepped forward without hesitation. He asked the shamans to prepare a ritual drink. The secret history is deliberately, conspicuously vague about what exactly this preparation contained, and he prayed aloud for the spirits to take him in his brother's place. Within days, he was dead. Ögedei recovered. The poisoning theory is darker, and, I'll be honest, not without circumstantial support. After Sanfengshan, Tolui's military reputation had reached extraordinary heights. He had executed one of the most brilliant flanking maneuvers in the history of the campaign, marching 300 kilometers through Song territory, then destroying a 200,000-man Jin army in a snowstorm. Ögedei, in the same campaign, had crossed a frozen river at the right moment. If you were a Mongol officer in 1232 and someone asked you which brother commanded more personal loyalty from the army, you would have had to think carefully about your answer. That is a dangerous position for a great Khan to be in. Did Ögedei order Tolui killed? The honest answer is, we don't know, and we probably never will. The secret history was compiled under the patronage of Tolui's descendants, people with every incentive to portray their ancestor heroically and to cast subtle doubt on the Ögedei line. The poisoning theory conveniently serves their political narrative. On the other hand, the historian Juveni, writing without a stake in Toluid family politics, simply records that Tolui drank himself to death. Alcoholism killed Ögedei himself, eventually. It killed Guyuk, Ögedei's son and successor. It killed numerous Mongol princes. The least dramatic explanation is often the correct one. But sometimes it isn't. What I find most interesting about this mystery is what it reveals about how Mongol political history was constructed. The people who wrote the secret history were working under Toluid patronage decades after these events. Every choice they made about what to include, what to emphasize, and what to obscure served a political purpose. When they describe Tolui's death as a heroic sacrifice, they are simultaneously lionizing Tolui and creating a narrative in which Ögedei is, at minimum, the passive beneficiary of his brother's death, and at maximum, someone who engineered it. That subtext was legible to contemporary readers in a way that made an explicit accusation unnecessary. What matters for our story is the aftermath. Ögedei, by all accounts, never fully recovered emotionally from Tolui's death. He lost the person he was probably closest to in the world, the brother he had campaigned with since childhood, the man who had just delivered him the strategic victory that would define his reign. The great Khan became increasingly withdrawn after 1232, increasingly dependent on alcohol, and increasingly delegating the management of the empire to others. He would authorize the Great Western Campaign that sent Batu Khan and Subutai crashing into Russia and Poland. He would oversee the completion of the Jin campaign. But the energy and focus of the early years of his reign were never quite there again. And the political time bomb was now ticking. The heirs of Ögedei and the heirs of Tolui would eventually fight for control of the entire Mongol world. That conflict, which would fracture the empire into competing successor states within a generation, traces its origins to this moment, the death of a brilliant general in circumstances that the people who wrote the history had very specific reasons to obscure. Back in Kaifeng, meanwhile, Subutai was running the worst siege of his career, and he was running it brilliantly. The Mongols began amassing around Kaifeng on February 6, 1232, and commenced the formal siege on April 8th. What followed was one of the great urban sieges of the medieval world, conducted at a scale that is almost impossible to fully comprehend from a modern vantage point. Kaifeng at this point held somewhere over 1 million people. It had been one of the most magnificent cities in the world. The Song Dynasty had used it as their capital before losing it to Jin in the 1120s, and the Jin had maintained it as a great imperial center for over a century. It was vast, heavily walled, and it had been receiving refugees from every northern territory the Mongols had taken over the preceding years. Every village that fell north of the Yellow River sent survivors south. Many of them ended up in Kaifeng. By 1232, the city was dangerously overcrowded, its food supplies strained before the siege even began, and its political structure already showing the stress fractures that a prolonged military crisis produces. Subutai ran the siege with the methodical efficiency you'd expect from the man, the standard Mongol playbook for walled cities, catapults to pound the walls and throw incendiaries into the city, sappers under mobile wooden shelters to dig under the foundations and collapse wall sections, multiple simultaneous probe attacks at different points to stretch the defenders thin, and, critically, total blockade to cut off all food, water, and communication from outside. The Jin stopped each approach. When Mongol sappers crept toward the walls under their shelters, the defenders lowered fire lances over the parapet and incinerated them. When Mongol catapult crews set up in range, the Jin's own catapults launched their thunderbombs, those iron-cased gunpowder devices, and destroyed the equipment and the men operating it. When Mongol assault parties rushed for a breach, fire lances met them at the gap. Subutai tried redirecting sections of the Yellow River to flood the approaches and cut off different sections of the wall. The defenders adapted. This was not what Subutai was used to. He had taken cities from Central Asia to the Caucasus, He had sacked Beijing. He was the architect of the greatest campaign of military scouting in history, the reconnaissance in force that had taken Mongol armies all the way to the Crimea. And here he was, grinding through month after month against a city full of desperate people who had nothing to lose and some remarkably effective weapons. What was happening inside those walls during this time was a slow catastrophe that the people living through it would never fully describe, because most of them didn't survive to describe it. Plague broke out. Not a minor illness, but a serious epidemic disease, spreading through the overcrowded city with the efficiency that only disease can achieve in a malnourished, stressed, sleep-deprived population with no ability to quarantine or flee. The death toll from disease alone was enormous. People were dying not from Mongol weapons, but from starvation and sickness, while the siege had barely entered its first season. The food supply collapsed progressively. First, the commercial stocks ran out. Then, whatever the government had in reserve was consumed. Then soldiers began seizing food directly from households, rationalizing it as a military necessity. The people who had the least, the refugees who had arrived with nothing, died first. The political structure of the city deteriorated in parallel. Officials were arrested on suspicion of treason, sometimes executed within days of the accusation, and replaced by new officials who then became the next suspects. The paranoia that accompanies a prolonged siege without any prospect of relief is its own form of catastrophe. Then, in the summer of 1232, there was a moment that could have changed everything. The Jin sent diplomats to negotiate. There was a Mongol diplomat, the sources name him as Tang Qing, who was apparently engaged in actual substantive discussion about terms that might end the siege. For weeks, it looked like there might be a way out that didn't involve total destruction. And then someone in the Jin court made a decision that still defies comprehension. They murdered Tang Qing and his entire entourage. I've read multiple accounts of this moment, and I genuinely cannot reconstruct the logic. The most charitable interpretation is that a faction within the Jin court, people who believed that surrender was impossible and capitulation was dishonor, killed the envoy to eliminate any chance of a negotiated outcome and force continued resistance. The less charitable interpretation is that it was simply a catastrophic breakdown of command authority, a decision made by someone who didn't understand or didn't care about the consequences. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was absolute and irreversible. The siege resumed with finality. There would be no more negotiations. Toward the end of 1232, Emperor Aizong made the decision that sealed Kaifeng's fate, though it didn't seal his own, at least not immediately. He slipped out of the city at night with a small retinue of loyal officials and guards, leaving behind the garrison commanders with instructions to hold as long as possible. He crossed the Yellow River and headed south. He reached Guide City in Henan on February 26, 1233. When word got out that the emperor had fled, the effect on morale inside Kaifeng was immediate and total. The men defending the walls had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that they were holding the last capital of the Jin Dynasty, that their emperor was with them, that there was something worth defending, that their sacrifice meant something. The moment Aizong left, that story collapsed. You can hold a war for months against impossible odds if you believe you're protecting something that matters. It is much harder to hold it when the person you're protecting has already decided to be somewhere else. One of the commanders remaining in the city was a general named Kui Li. He surveyed his situation, a plague-ridden, starving city, an emperor who had already escaped, soldiers whose morale was broken, a siege that was going to end only one way. And he made a calculation. He had the officers and officials still loyal to Aizong killed. He consolidated his own authority over what remained of the garrison. And on May 29, 1233, he opened the gates of Kaifeng and let Subutai in. Now. What happens next is one of those moments where a single individual genuinely changes history. And it's a person that almost nobody outside of academic circles knows about. Subutai wanted to massacre the entire population of Kaifeng. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was consistent with Mongol military doctrine. A city that resisted this long, that killed this many Mongol soldiers, that refused to surrender when the outcome was obvious, was by established practice forfeit. Every man, woman, and child. Standard procedure applied from Zhongdu to Merv to Nishapur. Ögedei's chief advisor, a Khitan statesman named Yelü Chucai, refused to accept this outcome. Yelü Chucai was a trained Confucian scholar of the old Liao imperial line who had served under the Jin and then under the Mongols since Genghis Khan's day. He had spent years making the argument, patiently, repeatedly, to audiences who often didn't want to hear it, that you extracted more long-term value from a taxed, living population than from a dead one. He went to Ögedei directly. The exchange that the sources record has Ögedei mocking him. Are you going to weep for the people again? But then listening, and then agreeing. The massacre was called off. Only 500 members of the Wanyan imperial clan were executed. Kaifeng's population, over 1 million people, already devastated by plague and famine but still alive, survived the conquest. Subutai was restricted to plunder. Yelü Chucai is not a name most Americans know, but if you're looking for the single individual whose intervention most directly preserved Chinese civilization through the worst of the Mongol conquest, he is your answer. His argument that you can conquer an empire on horseback but you cannot govern it on horseback was not philosophy. It was a practical policy with a direct, measurable body count. He saved millions of lives through the force of an argument about tax revenue. That is remarkable by any standard. Kui Li, for his part, was murdered shortly after the city fell, killed by a subordinate officer in a personal dispute over an insult to the man's wife. History is not always tidy. Let's follow Emperor Aizong, because his final year is one of the more remarkable sequences of events in the entire war, and it deserves to be told properly. After fleeing Kaifeng in late 1232, Aizong arrived in Guide City, modern Shangqiu, on the south bank of the Yellow River, on February 26, 1233. He arrived with a diminished retinue, loyal guards, a handful of officials, and very little else. Scattered remnants of Jin armies began converging on his position, drawn by the presence of their emperor. This should have been a moment of rallying, of rebuilding, of consolidating whatever military capacity remained. Instead, it became a demonstration of how completely the Jin court had lost control of its own internal dynamics. A Jin officer named Pucha Guanu commanded one of the remaining garrison forces in Guide. He had approximately 450 men under him, not a large force by any measure, but 450 armed, organized men are more than enough to control a court that has just survived a catastrophic defeat. Guanu staged what amounted to a coup. He had the military commander Ma Yong killed, along with hundreds of court officials who refused to cooperate with him, as well as roughly 3,000 palace guards, officers, and civilians who were deemed unreliable. He made Aizong a figurehead, and himself the real power. Then, from a position of having just massacred most of the functioning court, Guanu did something genuinely extraordinary. Under the cover of darkness, he loaded his 450 soldiers onto boats from the southern gate of the city, armed them with fire lances, and rowed along the eastern side of the city to the position of the Mongol camp on the river bank. They arrived before dawn. They attacked from 2 directions simultaneously. The fire lances threw the Mongol camp into panic, soldiers waking to jets of fire in their tents, stockades burning, no clear line of organized defense. More than 3,500 Mongol soldiers drowned in the river trying to flee. Every Mongol stockade was destroyed. The Mongol general commanding the operation, Sajisibuhua, was killed. 450 men, 3,500 Mongol dead. If Guanu had been fighting for a dynasty that still had a future, this would be celebrated as one of the great tactical victories of the era. It was, objectively, an astonishing military achievement. But it was also, in the larger context, a footnote, extraordinary in its execution, meaningless in its strategic effect. The Mongols lost a general and several thousand soldiers. They replaced them. The Jin lost 450 men they could not replace, and they'd made their position in Guide even more untenable by demonstrating to the Mongols that it needed to be eliminated quickly. Aizong had been watching the battle from the northern gate of the city, with his personal boat prepared in case the attack failed. Even in the moment of his most spectacular military success in this final phase, he was already thinking about the next escape route. That tells you the psychological state of the court by this point. Victory was temporary, survival was the only real strategy, and survival meant always having a boat ready. Guanu's power grab collapsed within months. Aizong, who had been underestimated as a politician by almost everyone who tried to manipulate him, engineered Guanu's assassination and re-established direct control. He then began preparations to move to Kaizhou, a city in southern Henan, close to the Song border, with better defenses and more remaining supplies than Guide. And he tried, one more time, to get the Song to help him. He sent multiple embassies south. His message was clear-eyed and accurate. He told the Song directly, "After we fall, you become the target." The Mongols have told us this themselves, and they have always been honest about their intentions. Help us now, and you extend your own survival. Refuse, and you are simply choosing to face them alone, later, after we are gone. This was not propaganda. It was a genuine strategic assessment from people who had been fighting the Mongols for 20 years and understood how they thought better than anyone else in the world. The Jin knew what was coming. Aizong's warning was not a bluff. It was the most accurate geopolitical prediction made by anyone in East Asia in the 13th century. The Song ignored it. Their own calculation, that Jin was dying anyway, that an alliance would be costly and uncertain, and that the Mongols might honor their promise to give Song the Henan territories, was more immediately appealing than the abstract warning of a desperate defeated enemy. So, instead of sending aid, they negotiated with the Mongols. General Meng Gong began preparing to march north. The alliance between the Mongols and the southern Song Dynasty, formalized in 1233, is one of those arrangements that looks, in historical retrospect, like two wolves negotiating over the division of a sheep. The Song got to participate in the destruction of their century-old enemy and potentially recover former territories. The Mongols got Song logistics support and military cooperation for the final campaign. The Jin got nothing, and the Song's own reckoning would arrive within a year of Jin's fall, right on schedule and exactly as Aizong had predicted. But in late 1233, that future was still invisible to the people making decisions. The immediate reality was that Emperor Aizong had reached Kaizhou, modern Runan County in Henan Province, on August 3, 1233. He arrived after months of desperate flight, with his forces reduced to a remnant, his court stripped to its core, and his options narrowing by the day. Kaizhou was not a great city. It was a secondary fortification, chosen because it sat closer to the Song border and had walls still intact and supplies still available. With the Song having chosen the Mongol side, even those modest advantages were about to evaporate. The Mongols arrived at Kaizhou in December 1233. Song General Meng Gong arrived with 10,000 Song soldiers shortly after. The city was completely encircled, Mongols from the north and east, Song from the south and west. Every route of escape was covered. What happened inside Kaizhou over the following weeks is harrowing even by the already grim standards of this war. The city's population had been massively swelled by every person from the surrounding region who had fled the Mongol advance. All of them terrified. All of them now trapped inside walls that were being systematically reduced from two directions. Famine set in almost immediately. There were no supply lines, no resupply convoys, no possibility of relief from outside. The records from this period are explicit and terrible. By the final weeks of the siege, cannibalism was occurring inside Kaizhou. People had eaten everything else. They were eating each other. And yet the Jin defenders kept fighting. They repelled assault after assault. Every time Mongol or Song forces breached a section of the wall, the defenders sealed it. Every time an attack came in strength at one point, the defenders found men to respond. These were people who knew exactly what surrender meant for them personally and for their families, and they fought with the specific ferocity of people who have nothing left to lose. In January 1234, the attackers found the weakness they'd been looking for. The Mongols broke the banks of the Lian River, and Song engineers successfully diverted the flow of the Ju River away from the city. And this engineering operation was decisive. It removed the water barriers protecting the western and southern approaches to Kaiju. By January 20th, Mongol forces had penetrated the western quarter of the city. Aizong had been trying to escape throughout the siege. Multiple attempts, multiple directions, each one blocked. The Mongols covered the northern and eastern exits. The Song covered the south. He had sent increasingly desperate messages to the Song court throughout, not pleading, exactly, but warning. Warning them again. Warning them that they were making a mistake of historic proportions. The messages went unanswered or answered with polite refusals. By February, the situation was undeniable. There was no escape. There was no relief. The western part of the city was in enemy hands. The defenders were fighting room to room in some areas. It was days, not weeks. Aizong gathered his remaining commanders for what would be his last address. The speech that survives in the sources is extraordinary in its combination of defiance and realism. He told his men that the Mongols were difficult opponents because they had absorbed Chinese military techniques, which was true. But the Song, he said, was another matter. Given 3,000 armored soldiers, he believed he could march straight into Song territory and take what he needed. They were weak, he said, not real warriors. It reads, on one level, like bravado. The kind of speech you give to keep men fighting when there's no rational reason left to fight. But it also reads as the genuine frustration of a man who had spent his entire reign facing threats from multiple directions with insufficient resources, who could see clearly that the enemy who had just betrayed him was weaker in many ways than the empire he was about to lose. He wasn't wrong about the Song. Their army had not performed well offensively against either the Khitan Liao or the Jurchen Jin over 100 years of conflict. The Mongols would prove that within a generation. But the assessment, accurate as it was, changed nothing about what was about to happen in Kaizhou. The end was now measured in hours. Before we get to the final scene, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is there. I've got viewers watching these videos at 2 a.m. in Melbourne, on lunch breaks in Chicago, and on commutes in Seoul. It's one of my favorite things about making history content, the reminder that people everywhere are curious about the same stories. And if you're not subscribed yet, now would be the moment. February 9th, 1234. Emperor Aizong of Jin had made his decision, and I find it genuinely moving, in a way that surprises me every time I sit with it. He did not want to be remembered as the last emperor of the Jin Dynasty. Not out of cowardice. His conduct throughout the war argues against cowardice. He had stayed in Kaifeng through the worst of the siege. He had tried, repeatedly and against diminishing odds, to find some path to survival. He had been clear-eyed and honest about his situation in ways that many rulers in his position would not have been. But the idea of having his name, his personal name, and his temple name attached to the final extinction of a dynasty that had ruled northern China for over a century was something he found unbearable. Not because of pride in the abstract, because of the weight of what it meant. He had not caused this catastrophe. He had inherited it. And to be the one holding the throne when the last wall fell, felt to him like a verdict on his entire reign that he hadn't earned. So he called for his army marshal, Wanyan Chenglin, a descendant of the Jin imperial clan, physically stronger than Aizong, younger, still capable of fighting when Aizong was not, and he abdicated. In a ceremony that had to be improvised on the spot, without protocol or preparation, inside a city that was being overrun, he passed the imperial seal and the authority of the Jin Dynasty to Wanyan Chenglin. A Chenglin became Emperor Mo, a posthumous title meaning the final emperor, a name he would receive only after death, bestowed by the people who mourned him. The logic behind this decision is worth understanding. Aizong was not simply refusing responsibility. He still had, somewhere in his mind, a faint and probably irrational hope that Chenglin, younger, healthier, commanding the respect of the soldiers still fighting in the streets, might somehow manage what Aizong himself had not. Might find a way through the Mongol lines, might rally whatever fragments of Jin resistance still existed elsewhere, and carry the dynasty's legitimacy forward. It was unlikely. It was probably impossible. But it was not entirely zero, and that was enough. Aizong hanged himself in the palace before the walls were fully breached, and he was 35 years old. His posthumous temple name, Aizong, meaning the pitiable ancestor, was chosen by the people who survived him and grieved for him. It is one of the more honest posthumous names in Chinese imperial history. He was pitiable, in the sense of deserving pity, not contempt, not condemnation, but the particular sorrow reserved for someone who tried hard enough and still lost. The Mongols, for their part, were less respectful. His personal name, Shoshu, sounded similar to a Mongol phrase meaning little slave. History is not merciful to the defeated. The walls fell on the same day. Mongol cavalry poured through from the north. Song infantry pushed in from the south. The scene inside Kaizhou on February 9th, 1234, what was the kind of chaos that medieval cities experienced at the end of sieges? Organized resistance collapsing into pockets of desperate last stands. Soldiers who had been holding formations dissolving into individuals trying to survive. Civilians caught in the middle of everything. Wanyan Chenglin, Emperor Mo, ruler of the Jin Dynasty for less than a single day, gathered his remaining men and fought in the streets. He died in the house-to-house combat that followed the breach. The last emperor of Jin died fighting, not hiding. That fact seems worth noting. His was the shortest reign in the dynasty's entire history, a few hours. The dynasty that had begun with the great Jurchen chieftain Wanyan Ögedei, declaring himself emperor in 1115, ended in the streets of Kaizhou with his descendant dying in the rubble. General Meng Gong, the Song commander, made sure to collect proof of the dynasty's end. He found what remained of Aizong's body in the palace. The Mongol general Tagachar claimed the emperor's hands, taken back to the Mongol camp as a trophy, evidence of personal achievement in the destruction of a great enemy. Meng Gong took the rest. The burned remains of Wanyan Shoshu, the last real emperor of Jin, were loaded onto a cart and carried south to Lin'an, modern Hangzhou, the Song capital. There, in the ancestral temple of the Song imperial family, the remains were offered as a formal sacrifice. 100 years of humiliation. The Jin conquest of northern Song in the 1120s, the capture of 2 Song emperors, the loss of the ancient capital at Kaifeng, all of it symbolically requited in one ceremony. Think about what that ceremony meant to the people participating in it. For 100 years, the Song had been the truncated, diminished, southern remnant of what had once been a unified Chinese empire. They had paid tribute. They had lost emperors to captivity. They had watched the north be governed by people they considered conquerors and outsiders. And now they were in their ancestral temple, presenting the burned bones of the man who had commanded that foreign dynasty's last stand. It must have felt, in that room, like justice. They had no idea they had just helped destroy the only buffer standing between them and what came next. The Jin dynasty came to its end on February 9th, 1234, 119 years after it began, 23 years after Genghis Khan first declared his intention to break it. 5 years after Ögedei Khan inherited that intention and decided to finish it. The ink on Jin's death certificate was barely dry before the consequences started cascading in every direction. The most immediate was the Song betrayal of the alliance, if betrayal is even the right word for what was really just naked opportunism. In the summer of 1234, 2 Song armies marched north into Henan province, into territory that was now technically under Mongol control. They walked into Kaifeng. They walked into Luoyang. They walked into Chang'an. The reasoning in the Song court was that these had once been Song cities before Jin took them, and now that Jin was gone, the principle of historical recovery justified occupation. What they found was a devastated landscape that could barely feed its own surviving population, let alone an occupying army. The infrastructure that had supported these cities, the agricultural systems, the supply networks, the administrative apparatus, had been gutted by 23 years of war. There was no food surplus. There were no welcoming local populations ready to rise up and assist. There was just ruin and Song armies that had extended themselves into territory they couldn't sustain. To make things worse, a Song officer murdered a Mongol ambassador. Whether this was ordered from above or was a local decision that escalated out of control, the effect was the same. Ögedei declared war on the southern Song. The war that followed lasted 45 years. The Song held out longer than almost anyone, fighting on the Yangtze, fighting in the mountains of Sichuan, fighting with a stubbornness and tenacity that the Jin had never quite been able to sustain. But the outcome was eventually the same. The Song fell in 1276 to Kublai Khan, Tolui's son, the very man whose father's death in 1232 had begun the Toluid succession that would ultimately complete the Mongol conquest of China. Aizong's warning had been right, word for word. The Song had listened to it and chosen not to believe it. They paid for that choice with their dynasty. Ögedei himself, after the Jin campaign, withdrew increasingly into the life he actually preferred: feasting, drinking, building, and administration at a remove from the fighting. He ordered the construction of Karakorum, a proper capital city for the Mongol Empire, built on the site of what had been his father's simple base camp on the Orkhon River. Karakorum grew into a walled city with a great palace, a diverse population of craftspeople and merchants from across the conquered world, and a court that received ambassadors from Europe, Persia, Korea, and China. He also authorized a comprehensive census of northern China for tax purposes, the practical implementation of Yelü Chucai's administrative philosophy, converting conquered territory into a sustainable revenue source rather than a stripped wasteland. The campaigns he authorized from Karakorum during this period are staggering in their scope. Korea was invaded in 1231 and eventually forced into vassalage. The Great Western Campaign that Ögedei approved at the Kurultai of 1235 sent Batu Khan and Subutai crashing through the steppes of Rus, destroying the kingdoms of Kiev and Rus, sacking cities from Ryazan to Kiev, and then turning west into Poland and Hungary. The Battle of Liegnitz, which you may know from another episode on this channel, happened under Ögedei's authority. The Mongols stood on the Danube. All of that was happening while the Jin campaign was being consolidated. Ögedei died in December 1241, almost certainly from the effects of decades of heavy drinking, the same cause that would kill several of his sons and successors. His death stopped the European advance cold because every senior Mongol commander had to return for the succession process. Historians debate whether Europe was saved by its own defences or by the death of one man from alcoholism. The evidence suggests it was mostly the latter. The population question in northern China after the Mongol-Jin War is something that serious historians continue to debate. And I want to be honest about the uncertainty. Older accounts gave figures of catastrophic depopulation, implying tens of millions dead. Modern scholarship is more cautious. A significant portion of the population of Jin's northern territories had migrated south into Songlands during the decades of warfare, rather than being killed. Agricultural collapse caused death from famine and disease that wasn't directly attributable to Mongol armies. And the Mongols, particularly after Yelü Chucai's influence took hold, became less systematically destructive of civilian populations in the later phases of the campaign. The suffering was real and enormous. The exact scale remains genuinely uncertain. What Yelü Chucai built in the aftermath deserves its own moment of recognition. The tax system he established across 10 administrative circuits of northern China generated annual revenues of approximately 500,000 liang of silver, 80,000 bolts of silk, and 400,000 shai of grain. That is an extraordinary amount of wealth to be extracting from a region that had been at war for 2 decades. And it was possible only because enough people had survived to produce it. His insistence on sparing populations wasn't charity. It was economics. And it worked. The long political shadow of Tolui's death in 1232 finally became fully visible in 1251, when Mungke, Tolui's son, displaced the Ögedei line and became Great Khan. The empire that Ögedei had managed was subdivided, then subdivided again. By the time of Kublai's reign, the 4 major successor states, the Yuan in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, were more often at war with each other than cooperating. The seed of that fragmentation was planted in a winter camp in 1232, when Tolui died under circumstances that nobody was willing to explain clearly. Ögedei finished the war. But the peace he built didn't last because the empire he ran was always one succession crisis away from fracture. That's what happens when you build something vast enough that everyone wants a piece of it. So what do we take from all of this? Ögedei Khan finished a war that had been grinding for 23 years, and he did it in 5. He did it not by being the bravest man in the field, Tolui was braver. Not by being the most tactically brilliant, Subutai was more brilliant. But by being smart enough to identify who needed to be where, and confident enough to let them do their jobs. By being willing to authorize the 3-pronged flanking strategy that required marching hundreds of miles through a neutral country. A plan that required nerve as much as genius, and by being capable, at a crucial moment, of listening to an advisor who told him that slaughter was the wrong answer. That combination is rarer than it sounds. Aizong is the figure I keep coming back to personally. He was a ruler who did nearly everything right, reformed his administration, ended unnecessary wars, rallied his people, and still lost, because the deficit he had inherited from the emperors before him was simply too large to overcome in the time he had. His name means pitiable ancestor. I don't think pitiable is wrong. But I'd add, dignified. He chose not to be the last emperor. He chose to die before the walls fell. He made those choices with full understanding of what they meant. That's nothing. That's actually quite a lot for a man in an impossible situation. And then there's Yelü Chucai. In a story full of military commanders and emperors and khans, he is the one figure who operated entirely in the space between conquest and governance, and he bent the arc of history towards something less catastrophic through sheer force of reasoned argument, made at the right moment to the right person. He deserves to be known. He's not. Here is my question for the comments. Do you think Ögedei had Tolui poisoned? I've laid out the evidence. The shamanic ritual story has obvious political motivations behind it. The alcoholism explanation is the simplest and consistent with everything else we know. The poisoning theory is the most dramatic, but relies on reading political subtext across 8 centuries. I genuinely don't know the answer. Tell me where you land on it. If this video gave you something, a story you didn't know, a person you hadn't heard of, a moment that hit different than you expected, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and share it with someone else who would appreciate it. These videos take serious research and serious time, and every person who watches and subscribes is directly what makes the next one possible. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. The Jin Dynasty fell on February 9th, 1234, 119 years after it began. 23 years after Genghis Khan first moved against it. 5 years after Ögedei Khan decided he was going to be the one to finish it. I'll see you in the next one.